Okay, I know this is kind of ghetto, but I'm going to be cutting the first piece of rectangular fabric. This is the main fabric of the hat for a size small. So I have the rotary cutting board here, which is really nice because it has all the inch increments lined up. Not that I'm really using it, but it helps me line up the fabric. And then the cutting guide also has all the inches, so you can see that I have my fabric. The fold is right here, so I folded over to just a length of 13.25 inches, so that when it's unfolded, the total length is 26.5 inches. So you can see I've lined up the one here, and it goes down to 13.25 inches. And this cutting guide is 6½ inches, and the rectangular piece is only 6 inches tall, so I have the excess 0.5 inch hanging over the edge. And this is just a guide that helps me not cut my fingers. So here's my rotary cutter, and I'm going to cut the top segment here. And I line it up with the selvage of the fabric here just so that I don't waste anything. It's really nice and easy. There we go. So this is the rectangular piece of the main fabric unfolded. It is 6 inches tall and 26.5 inches long. Now after we've cut out the rectangular piece of fabric, it's time to cut out the circular top of the hat, which for the small sized hat is an 8-inch diameter circle. And I've folded over the fabric to just about a 4-inch height here. And this is something called a circle cut, and it's a template for a half circle. So the fold here is on the bottom. Of course, you could just cut out an 8-inch circle and use that as a pattern piece. But as you can see, it has all these different diameter circles, and I'm going to lay it down here. And this is the 8-inch half circle, and it has a guide for my cutter. It's really easy. Hopefully I won't cut myself. My son practicing the trumpet. But I'll start on this side. And there's your 8-inch circle. All right, here we are now. I'm going to cut the rectangular piece of the inner contrast fabric. So again, I've folded the fabric over. The fold is here. I folded it to just a little bit more than 13.25 inches. I've laid out the cutting guide. It's 13.2 inches on the fold. Here's the end, and here we go. So easy. I like to put a piece of decorative ribbon on the outside of the hat, so I'm going to chalk in a line to use as a guide when I pin on that ribbon. I like to place the line 2.25 inches from the bottom of the main contrast. So I've lined up my guide here, 1 inch, 2 inches, 2.25 inches, and I have this really cute little clover chalk marker, but you can also use a fabric marker that washes out or just disappears when it dries. So I just line up my thing here, and I just do it for the entire length. of the fabric. And then the chalk eventually just kind of wears off as I'm handling the fabric. Now I've already cut a piece of ribbon that is slightly longer than the edges because you just never know. And I'm going to align the ribbon so the top of the ribbon is on the line. And I'm just going to start pinning it in place. Kind of like this rotary mat, rotary cutting board, because it's really nice to use your pins on as well. And when I was cutting that ribbon, I also cut another piece approximately 8 inches long, and this is I'm going to use to make a bow on the back of the hat. And you're going to have to seal these edges. See how it's starting to fray here already? Just run a lighter over the edges and it'll seal it. And you'll eventually kind of make that bow, and it'll look kind of like that, roughly. All right, on to sewing. All right, I'm just finishing sewing on the ribbon to the front main fabric of the hat. I have already sewn on the top part of the ribbon, and I'm finishing up sewing on the lower part of the ribbon here. And now with right sides together, I'm going to sew this rectangle into a tube. I'm using about a 1/4 inch seam, I believe. I usually line up the end of the fabric to the end of my presser foot here, so I think that's about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to trim that extra bit of ribbon. And now with it turned right side out, I'm going to place my little bow right here in the center. I'm just making that bow right now. That's with the 8-inch piece of separate ribbon that I cut. I'm going to lay it right on top of that center part. And anchor it right down to that seam. And now you can see that the back part of the main fabric of the hat is done. Now I'm sewing the contrast fabric, the rectangle. I'm sewing it into a tube, so with right sides together and the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now going to, with right sides together, I'm going to sew the main fabric to the contrast, and you're going to be sewing these together towards the side of the fabric near the ribbon. So centering that back seam together, right sides together. Don't even need to pin it because they're perfectly shaped for each other. I just check from time to time that the two fabrics are still aligned. You could pin it, I suppose. I'm just a bit lazy. Then I'm going to turn it inside out, and I'm going to start pressing. I'm going to show you how to make that ribbon. Please excuse the super messy craft room in the background. So here's the 8-inch piece of ribbon that I had cut, and I asked you to run a lighter over the edges because they will start to fray after you wash it repeatedly. So it's really easy. Just light your lighter and then pass it over the flame once or twice, and that will seal the edges. My ceiling fan is like making this a fire hazard. So you can tell that the edges now are not going to fray. And then I use a little template to make this bow, and I use this card. This is what bias tape comes wrapped around, and it's like the perfect size for making this bow. So what I do is I place my 8-inch piece of ribbon past the midline of the card, wrap it around, come around, and then about, a little less than a centimeter from the edge, I turn the direction and then flip the edge over. And I slide it off the card. And here's your little bow. Just line up the center of the bow with your center seam in the back of the hat. You can pin it on. I just kind of approximate it. Sometimes I'm kind of off, but it's really easy that way. Now I'm going to start pressing the hat. And the first thing I've done is I've turned it completely inside out. And I'm just going to press that seam where I sewed the front to the back flat. I'm just doing this on the end of my ironing board. Now that I've done that, I'm going to turn the whole thing so that I can see the right side of the contrast fabric. And you can see that pretty side on the inside. And I'm going to press this seam. Now we are ready to start pinning the top of the hat. Press that down a little bit. Start pinning the top of the hat. So here's the inside, and I usually start pinning where I can see that back seam, and right sides together. Remember, this is the 8-inch circle. I'm gonna start pinning it all the way around. It's usually just an exact perfect fit, but you can adjust tighter or looser if you seem to have an excess or a deficit of fabric, either in the circle or in the tube portion. See, I have a little bit more of the circle, so I'm just going to pull it, and I'll kind of take up that allowance when I sew it. Now I'm just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around here, and then I'm going to serge the edges on my serger, and then I'll return. Alright, here we are coming down the home stretch. So I sewed on the top of the hat with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I serged it. I just happen to have black thread on my serger. Now I'm turning it finally so it's right side out, and I'm going to top stitch where the top of the hat meets the brim of the hat, or the remainder of the hat. I'm just sewing as close as I can. I just think it looks neater when you have a top stitch. And now the very last part is creating the casing for the small bit of elastic. Let's see if I can get a light on this without, I think you can see better without it, honestly. So for a small hat, what I do is from the center seam in the back, I measure out and pin 3.75 inches, and I mark with a pin to the right of the center seam and 3.75 inches to the left of the center seam. And this is basically, I'm going to sew about a ½ inch from pin to pin, and the area in between the contrast and the main fabric is going to form the casing for the elastic. So I'm just eyeballing what looks to be about a casing of roughly, oh, that's a little shy of a centimeter, to be honest. Sorry. Okay, so this is going to form the casing. And now I have cut a piece of elastic. It's very thin elastic. I think it is 1/4 of an inch elastic, and I've measured it out at 3 1/2 inches for a small sized hat. And you're wondering how in the world am I going to get the elastic in this casing, because I've already sewn it shut. And the way that I'm going to do this is I look at the area I've sewn shut, and I'm going to pick open just a very small amount of this bottom seam here on the inside of the casing. And this is how I'm going to get so this is just my seam ripper. I'm going to find like one thread, and now I'm going to, you can see how I've got this open, and here, right here is the end of the casing. I've opened it up right about there, and I'm doing the same thing on the other side. Just one stitch and pull it open. I used to sew a piece of bias tape to the back to make a casing, but it was a little more bulky. Just getting my extra strays now. I'm going to take my elastic here and put a safety pin through it. And now I'm going to thread it through a little hole in my casing. Start threading it through. And then with my little sewing tweezers, I'm going to tuck it in so it extends just a little bit beyond the area where I've sewn the casing. And now I'm going to close the ends of the casing, and as I do this, it will sew the elastic in place. And then what about that hole that I created in the bottom seam? Well, I'm turning it now, and I'm going to sew that hole closed, just like this. It's important that the bottom thread match the back color, otherwise you'll be able to see all this extra stitching, but it'll be pretty invisible now. Okay, I can feel the elastic. It's sticking out through the end of the casing. I can feel my safety pin in here, and I'm using it to pull through the casing until I get to the hole. Here it is, pulling out my elastic here. And now I'm going to use my tweezers to feed it through just beyond where I created that casing. I'm doing it funky so you can kind of see it here. And with the elastic extending beyond the casing, I'm going to sew it in place. You might not be able to see this because of my finger. But the end of the casing captures the elastic and holds it in place. And then I'm going to sew closed that opening that I created with my seam ripper. Trim my edges. And now you see the back of the hat has this little gathering, and on the inside, you can't really tell. And the last thing I'm going to do is find a pretty button just to put on the end. I'll do that separately. Alright, here's the last part and the most fun part. You pick some cute buttons that you think might look nice. I kind of like this flower with a little contrasting center in it, and I'm going to put it right in the middle. So I'm just going to I'm not even knotting the end of my thread, to be honest with you. I'm just coming from behind and entering on one side of the center seam of the little bow I have here. And then I'm going to sew in my cute little flower here. Little center. Come through to the back because I'm going to tie the knot in the back. And I'll leave a little bit for tying back here. I'll just probably poke through one more time. Thank God I don't have to hand sew the whole thing here. And just throw down a couple of surgical knots there. I usually do quite a few because I would be really sad if these buttons came out. I don't know, 10 or so. Give yourself a little tail. When you're done, hat, cute button. There we go. And you're done.